The first thing to establish is which prosthesis, Hegel's monster propounded after the proposal had been read aloud. I would imagine, he added, looking about at his fellow committee members. Burstow opened his mouth to speak, but before he could correct Hegel's monster, Appling Walleye, the newest member of the committee, asked, "Who's George Clooney?" "Good-looking son of a bitch in the movies," Todd Retch, his left-hand neighbor, leaned close and explained in a terse undertone. "Never heard of him." Walleye, sounding exasperated, threw himself back in his comfortable executive-type office chair. Due to some sort of defect in the chair's armature, a defect at first attributed to terrorism, Walleye fell over, backwards. He tried to catch himself on something, but only succeeded in knocking down a potted fern sitting on a pedestal against the wall. "Is there a limit on how many times you can watch this?" Pleat Mathras asked the attendant as the film of Appling Walleye's fatal accident ended. "Well, metaphysically, I'm sure there is." The attendant fluffed the cushion behind Pleat's head and then the one behind Angelica's. "But in terms of directly bearing on your query, you are allowed to watch as much as you like until the facility closes." "I see." Pleat nodded, kept his eyes on the thin man until he left the room, and then growled, "Smart ass." Angelica smiled. She helped Pleat reset the film viewing machine, noting as she did that she had seen a George Clooney movie once. "Oh, really?" Pleat pressed the start button, thinking she'd say, "Oh, mister, how could you?" or "Political Messiah." "Yeah," she said, "it was called Endeavor is the least of the architect's qualities in reviewing his failures." Most people who saw the film assumed that the song that played over the opening credits was by Sting. However, it was actually sung by Merton Halflaffer, an associate of the band Nostril Mate. He worked with them in much the same way that Robert Hunter worked with the Grateful Dead, Clouto told Nancy Burke. "But Sting does have a song called Architect's Blues, doesn't he?" Nancy glanced up from preening the golden-tipped fur on the backs of her hands. "Yes," Clouto agreed. He was so happy to meet a girl who knew something about music. "And that may account for the confusion. But that song is on the soundtrack to Olfactory Triplet, a film starring George Clooney's hated rival, the reanimated Cary Grant." As he said this, the camera pulled back to reveal the valley below, across which the armies of the great Raga had erected their tents like so many nubby things on a welcome mat. Jerry and I sat near the front of the theater. I was eating popcorn that I had smuggled in. I had also smuggled in a microwave oven and a couple of cotton kitchen towels, a feat that would have amazed my friend several years ago, but today elicits only silence, for I have no friends left. Jerry, who is a friend, but only an imaginary one, turned to me and asked, "Does Clouto seem more intelligent and articulate than usual?" "Well, you've got to give him some leeway. He's talking to a girl. He's trying to impress her. Stuff comes out that surprises you when you're with someone you really feel comfortable with." Shards of popcorn flew from my mouth. "Give who some leeway?" Jerry asked. "Okay, the writer." Down in the valley, the great Raga, played by George Clooney in a beard of Babylonian proportions, emerged from his royal tent. Attendants strewed scented petals under his feet. "Strewed?" he roared. "Is that right? Strewed?" Somebody looked that up. The great book was opened. Its cover, as tall as a tall man, fell towards the camera. Fortunately, we were not watching the 3D version. Consulting the little homemade notebook that I kept in my shirt pocket, I found the following title/scenario and made a story out of it. "Farm Boy's Weapons Grade Cynical Trophy Massage Yourself." One of the traveling salesmen from the opening train scene in the film version of Pigeonfoot's Bridge Mix pulled up to the old farmhouse in a rented car. In his samples case, which he opened for all the family to see, he had a rather most interesting item, as he put it. It was shaped just like a cycling trophy that Luke, the titular farm boy, had seen in the hands of an actor on the television set that stood among the bushels of corn in the mortuary. It represents victory, Luke thought, as the salesman placed the trophy-looking thing on the floor. Other items soon joined it, each described as another rather most interesting item, but Luke's attention did not waver. He knew that if he was allowed to have anything at all, it would be limited to one purchase. "Well, I'll be stymied like a storm," Luke's father, sitting on the edge of his chair, commented once the salesman had finished presenting his inventory and turned expectantly to the family. "You've sure got some kind of an array of stuff there, that's for sure." "Dad, I want that trophy-looking thing," Luke announced. He pointed, his skinny finger attached to an arm even more proportionately skinny. The arm protruded from a t-shirt that bore a cracked iron-on transfer of an outdated image of Mrs. Freshley's honey bun wrapper. I doubt Luke had never eaten a honey bun of the Mrs. Freshley's brand or any other, as the family's diet had consisted almost entirely of corn and pork byproducts for nearly as long as the boy had been alive. Where he got the t-shirt is something of a mystery. He also had a shirt with a picture of Cary Grant in his original form on it. The presence of neither of these shirts in the farm boy's wardrobe can be explained without a fuller understanding of the family circumstances, for only grandfather, but recently dead, was rumored to have ever visited town, a place where such ornamented clothing might be obtained. The salesman glanced uneasily between the boy and his sun-damaged father. "I don't know if you heard me or not," he said, "but this item is generally considered one of an adult nature." He continued his alternating glances, daring not to look at either the family's mother, sitting in mummified marshmallow-like immobility on a frayed cane-backed chair, or the older lady, who could have been anyone's grandmother, even Geronimo's. Such was the appearance she presented in her stiff calico skirt and leather bonnet. The two girls, twins possibly, sat apart from the circle of the family and guest, playing some diabolically engrossing game involving a handful of mismatched buttons and a dead cricket. "Well, that's something," the father said absently. His eyes, lively little animals in a bed of wrinkled red grit, seemed not to focus on any one of the salesman's wares, but to take them all in at once, like an aristocrat in the reviewing stands looking down on a parade ground full of troops. He then chuckled and shook his head, evidently bemused by this crazy thing called life. "So can I get that one, the trophy-looking thing?" Luke asked again, rising from his place on the floor to reach hopefully for the object. 20 minutes later, the salesman was on his way, having unburdened himself of nothing but the so-called trophy, and then that in exchange for a trunk full of reluctantly accepted corn. Later that afternoon, the boy, accompanied by his old retriever Coburn, took his new acquisition out past the drying sheds to where the Tulutskis' property began, in a thicket of blackberries under the ugly old pine. There he examined it more closely, noticing several features that were never on any trophy presented to a cycling champion in that state. They were small black knobs marked with silver symbols at the base of the cup. Luke pressed and twisted them with no result other than a faint buzzing from within the base of the trophy. Coburn seemed interested in the noise, so Luke allowed the dog to put his muzzle into the open end of the cup. Immediately blue tendrils of electricity surrounded the animal's immersed body part, prompting Coburn to whine and try to pull away, but he was stuck. Luckily, Luke had maintained a firm grip on the trophy, or the dog would have run off with it still attached. Luke hammered at the knobs until the buzzing and the crackling ceased. As the cup fell away, the dog's muzzle was revealed. It was now devoid of fur and painfully swollen to nearly twice its normal size. In addition, it looked very much like, in fact it had to be, so similar was it, a penis. Luke examined the bottom of the device to see how many batteries it took. The next story was also concocted using a title in my notebook as its starting point. However, it might also have actually happened to Agent Seville. Mobile fungus lumbering. Clark Seville was the first to arrive on the scene. "What's the situation?" he asked as he stepped out of his black brick-shaped van. One of the group of laboratory technicians, identifiable by their long white coats bearing the Sponge Cookie Sampler Band logo on the back, to whom the question was addressed, gave Seville a summary of the events of the past hour. "The fungus is now at the wheel of a peanut-shuffling wig," the tech man concluded. He pointed to a rosette of amber moving about on the floor of the gribillary tank, nearly a quarter of a mile below. Seville glanced about the frighteningly slender scaffolding on which he and the others stood. "No rope," he cursed mentally. "Any way down other than the ladder?" he asked. "Only the descension crane," the same technician answered, indicating a hook and cubicle assembly hanging over the abyss, "and it's not working." "Not working?" Seville repeated almost absently. "Yes, and it was one of the first things to go offline once the fungus's wastewater drained into the oscillosocket." Seville examined the bolt securing the top of the ladder to the platform. His eye followed the steps down until they blurred together into a single perilous line. He straightened himself and began unbuttoning his black wool overcoat. "Are you climbing down there?" one of the technicians, this one a curly-headed blonde, asked the big man, whom some people compared to Frankenstein as portrayed by George Clooney. "I see no other way, if—" His words were interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle. It was a small, sleek, black cruiser shaped much like an amphibian bat. Out of it jumped one of Seville's fellow agents. Cooler McCrud. A little shorter than Seville, much leaner, in appearance like an uncaring pretty boy. He stepped purposely to the very edge of the platform and looked down. His own black wool overcoat was already unbuttoned. It flapped ominously about him. "About the fungus down there?" McCrud queried without taking his eyes from the target below. Seville, who had watched McCrud's approach with masterfully camouflaged contempt, now stared at the other man's profile and felt the corners of his mouth twitch with rising bile. He inhaled through his nose with slow deliberation. "Yes," he answered. "That ladder's not going to hold you," McCrud warned matter-of-factly. "Why don't you let me do it?" He turned to Seville and stared at the bridge of his nose. Seville tossed his overcoat onto the upright tiller of a nearby pallet jack. He turned his back to the edge of the tank and stepped down onto the first rung of the ladder. If it's too dangerous for one, it will certainly be too dangerous for two," he said between his teeth as he moved robotically downwards. "I didn't say it was too dangerous for anyone." McCrud now stood at the top of the ladder. He raised his voice to be heard by the slowly descending of Seville. "I said it was too dangerous for you. You outweigh me by a good 40 pounds. There was no response. McCrud turned about with the word "fool" just behind his lips. He caught sight of the now even more tightly huddled group of technicians. "Any way of getting that crane working?" he snapped. Down on the side of the tank, perhaps 1/4 of the way to the bottom, Clark Seville concentrated on nothing more than the steady progression of steps, his own mechanical movements. The ladder had never been intended for use by humans, but by small monkeys trained specifically for the task. Already several bolts had snapped during Seville's passage. He found his thoughts drifting, not to some poignant moment in his life or to philosophy undone by heat, but to the time McCrud came to the office in a purple bow tie dotted with yellow crabs, the smell of good times and easy flair trailing behind him like a discarded uterus. Finally, Seville reached the floor of the tank. He had known it was coming. His peripheral vision had prepared him. What surprised him was the weakness in his legs as he stepped away from the ladder. "Starting tomorrow," he ordered himself, "you're going to start running again." He could hear the whisking noise of the peanut-shuffling wig as it skidded and martied its way around. He could see it not 100 feet away, describing a lumpy circle across the floor stained here and there with gribillary oxidation. He started forward, straining for a look at the wig's mycological driver. The wig was only moving at approximately 30 to 35 miles per hour, yet its locks were whipped about by its movements in such a way that it would be difficult to intercept it. Seville placed himself directly in its path. Through the extruded resin tresses, he saw the fungus in the wig's control cabin. Did the fungus see him? Was the monstrosity capable of understanding? Seville's briefing had only been cursory. He readied himself to jump. From above, Cooler McCrud landed on top of the wig just as Seville found himself swept along in its wake. Somehow McCrud managed to secure the crane's hook to the crown of the wig. The whole assembly, wig, fungus, and the two agents, was then hoisted into the air. Seville fought his way into the cabin. As he forced the fungus, a white mass of bubbles and striations as big as a petting zoo donkey, to allow him room to sit, he spied McCrud on the other side of the cabin, doing the same thing. "McCrud!" Seville barked. "You are a bastard!" "You're lucky to be alive," McCrud returned. "You should have waited." The fungus thrashed about between them, causing the wig to rock precipitously. Although Seville had been ordered to spare the fungus if possible, he had also been given clearance to terminate it if necessary. From inside his jacket, he unholstered a can of Lysol with a special blasting radius nozzle. He began spraying. The fungus, writhing under the fungicide's effects, yet managed to croak out a question. "Is that the fresh linen scent?" Several minutes later, as the people in the lab coat spooned out the inside of the wig, McCrud lifted his sleeve to his nose and sniffed. "That shit stinks," he told Seville. "I'll have to go home and take a bath." "You do that," Seville said, then turned and stalked back to his vehicle. When I fill up one of my little books, I make a new one. Periodically, one may make a fresh start. If this involves emotional upheaval, then so be it. The tawdry mountain which unwinds in clam grease. I was going through my pockets while listening to the Madhouse album 8 one Saturday morning and came across a folded piece of paper. It was a note torn from a missing dog flyer. Someone named Crobat had signed it. It read, "Enlist the Walnut's white penis." I had no memory of receiving the note, nor of meeting anyone named Crobat. I wondered if this Crobat had slipped it into my coat pocket like Sean Connery and Goldfinger. If so, shouldn't I have been crushed into a cube by now? Jerry wasn't around, so I had no one to to ask for help with my memory. Consulting my diary wouldn't be of any use. I didn't feel like trolling through years of entries, getting absorbed in their contents, just to figure this out. I decided to use the random approach to solve the mystery. It would be an excellent way to put my theories to the test. I turned the note over. There was a dog's paw on the ragged edge. Below was a phone number. I called it. "Hello?" A husky young woman's voice answered. "Hello there. I found your dog." There was a moment of silence in tribute to this disclosure. "You found my dog." The voice knew how to deal with crazy people. "Yes, I saw the flyer with this number on it, and—" She hung up on me. Of course, I reasoned that the note was so old that whoever had the phone number and the lost dog had long since moved away to be replaced by this unhelpful female. But I was not lost. I examined the note again. "Enlist the walnut's white penis." I would do exactly that. I would enlist the help of the walnut's white penis. Now, it would be most unsatisfactory if Crobat and the walnut turned out to be synonymous. Therefore, I proceeded on the theory that they were distinct things or personalities. Perhaps the Crobat was used to smash the walnut. I opened the encyclopedia to the article on the walnut. True, the book was issued in 1977, but I trusted that the information within would still be valid. The meat of the walnut, the article said, is shaped like the brain of certain invertebrate leptovores. Ah, this was useful. This led to the walnut's use in divination among the Chudi tribesmen once the local leptovores became extinct. I turned to the article on the Chudi. An ancient people that lived in the region now known as North Carolina. I shut the volume with an angry snap once I had finished perusing several interesting but unrelated articles. North Carolina. I wasn't going to go all the way to North Carolina just for this. No, instead I would go to Watkins and visit the Leonard Nimoy Memorial. I had associated the memorial with North Carolina since childhood because I had two cousins from North Carolina who had been to the memorial a couple of times. They had souvenirs from the place that I found fascinating when I visited them. Something about the graphic design of the place. It was like Mayan architecture and hieroglyphs as filtered through the post-war cartoons. I did indeed go to Watkins, but wound up at the prefectural instead. I arrived in the middle of the night. The Leonard Nimoy Memorial was closed, so I drove around until I came across Cemetery Hill, the highest point in Watkins. On its summit stood the prefectural, a 300-foot-tall white structure much like an obelisk, only more squat and without the pyramidal top. Inside was a wishbone-like object that hung from the ceiling of the prefectural's hollow interior, almost down to the floor. One could climb the staircase that wound around the walls of the ceiling and touch the wishbone. This was supposed to bring you, not luck, but deep personal insight. Standing outside the entrance to the prefectural, with the sun just coming up in the distance, looking up at the white stone building, I found myself overcome with fear. Going inside and seeing the wishbone would be like meeting Santa Claus, face to face with the brick wall of solipsism's limits. The Crobat's advice was interpreted allegorically. I added the walnut's white penis to the roster of possible band names should I ever have a band, which looked less and less likely every fucking day. Self-contained moron. Stupid story. The mountain's discovery heralded the coming of the impure piano. After waking up on my return, I asked Jerry if there had been any developments during my absence. "A large package was delivered," he replied. "A very large package." I went into the parlor indicated and saw what Jerry meant. It was indeed a large package. On the side was stenciled, "Your sadness is at an end." "I have much curiosity, Jerry-san," I said. "Fetch a crowbat." "You mean a crowbar?" A crowbar. While I awaited his return with the implement, I thought back on birthdays as a child. You never knew what you were going to get. Sometimes the surprise was delightful. Sometimes it was a cheaply manufactured Pachisi game. The package contained an upright piano. How did they get it in here, I wondered, hoping Jerry had the answer. He did. They had a trained gorilla in a boiler suit. He had a little trouble with it, but not too much. I pulled up a chair. I played a couple of chords. It sounded terrible. "Needs tuning," I commented sourly, but the tuner we engaged for the job found nothing wrong with the tuning. "This piano," he proclaimed, striking the lowest key a couple of times, "is impure." He suggested we have the instrument humanely destroyed, but I thought of a better idea. After the man left, I told Jerry, "I can write impure songs on this thing." "Impure songs?" "Sure," I was enthusiastic. "Surely," Jerry corrected. I will demonstrate the hardness of my umbrella, momentarily depressed by punitive documents. "Aren't we going to the prefectural?" Jerry asked. He sounded a little like a little kid, disappointed that the ice cream cone turned out to be a lie. I don't know why. It wasn't his pilgrimage deferred. It wasn't his enlightenment at stake. "I've already been," I replied. "When?" In my mind. I tapped my right temple. Jerry sighed, threw up his hand, sat down on an ottoman. So now, or what are we going to do? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to work on my novel. I almost said the word with the heavy sarcasm that it deserved. I might even have made quotation marks in the air, but for George Carlin's admonition not to. You're so pig-headed. I'm sorry. I packed Jerry into my valise into an interior pocket of my coat, told Seville he was dismissed, and got out of the car. I'm sorry, Mr. Toadsgood, but I've been given orders. Seville tried to stop me from wandering away. I know. I gave them. I held up a diploma heavily appended with wax seals, instantly recognizable to Seville, proving to him that, in fact, I was the head, not only of Space Limited Accomplishments, but of the suggestible trapezoid as well. Wait for Alec, I ordered, then take the car back to headquarters. I'm off. I just couldn't take it anymore. Paranoia leakage at the old debate bath. Hank Fetlock, his dandy in his pickled cheese malt apothecary's beret as horses for war, greeted Mark Lohengrin as the latter entered the lobby of what we like to call the debate bath. Greetings, old fellow, Fetlock hailed the pole feebler from his perch beneath the statue of Peter Murphy that enlivened one corner of this lobby. Lohengrin, who had had enough of Fetlock in his previous incarnation as a carnation, remembered how a female cousin of his had once demonstrated her chicken putting to sleep technique. He hadn't thought of that in years. He had to smile when he thought of the girl's mother, his great-uncle's wife. She was a good-looking, personable, and evidently somewhat intelligent woman who had allowed herself to become morbidly obese. He wondered what had happened to her. Lohengrin had had no contact with any of his extended family in years. Was she dead? What had become of her daughter? I wonder if she turned out as good-looking as her mother, Lohengrin commented to another visitor to the bath, a medium-sized pachyderm who yet displaced more water than any two other human bathers. Why aren't you telling me? The pachyderm asked, scanning the emergency exit over Lohengrin's shoulder, but in the end opting to pull the plug, a massive rubber stopper whose dangling at the end of the chain heralded the disappearance of the chicken hypnotist's cousin down the drain. The sunshine of industry. The box was supposedly full of sunflower seeds. I don't know if it was or not. I wasn't allowed to open it. Normally, of course, being officially allowed to do something is no obstacle to me in such situations. But there were government employment facilitators hiding all around me, sneaky little men who could make things unpleasant for me should I step too far over the line. However, I was able to make a copy of the logo on the side of the box. This logo, depicting a happy Mr. Sun emerging from behind some loosely defined clouds, was supported by a slogan reading, "Nature's sunshine." This immediately set me to wondering what sunshine could possibly derive from that which is not nature. Nuclear power? As odd as it might seem to some people, even nuclear power is natural. In fact, everything is natural. There's no such thing as the unnatural, just as there isn't any such thing as the supernatural. Therefore, I concluded, incorrectly as it later turned out, that what the slogan makers must have meant was the opposite of industrial sunshine. Chapter 8. Alec was a long time in returning to the car. He had been attracted by the pork skin vendors. These grim fellows, dressed for rain, made the extremely hard variety of pork skins, so-called washpot pork skins. As he selected a bag with a homemade label, Uncle Rooter's Washpot Pork Skins, he thought about how the perfect accompaniment to this snack would be grape soda. As the vendor bent to make change out of a metal box at his feet, he revealed a folding table behind him ranged with many drinks, among them not only grape soda, but the very brand of grape soda that Alec had had in mind, Buddy Groins. Now Alec was truly content. He had his pork skins and his grape soda, and he was mingling with his kind of people, science fiction nerds. He stopped before an impromptu display of the Vulcan nerve pinch and consumed his food and drink happily as he watched. "You shouldn't have settled for such fare," a voice behind him admonished. "Oh, I like this kind of stuff once in a while," he added, as he turned to look at this distributor of unasked-for advice. It was an older man in the guise of Captain Picard. "Nothing wrong with that," the bald-headed fellow replied, "only I have a food replicator at my dwelling. If you're not too full, you may wish to sample pork skins made the molecular assembly way." "Bosh!" Alec laughed, giving himself time to decide if this stranger was actually inviting him to his house for another type of repast. "Do you mean a sexual one?" Jerry asked on hearing the above introduction to this segment. I merely nodded paternally and continued with my recapitulation of Alec's story. Alec's vague fears were quelled by the size of the group that accompanied the fake Captain Picard. His real name, it turned out, was Rusty McCabbage, back to his dwelling, as he referred to it. There were about a dozen of them, all science fiction nerds. Alec kept telling himself how wonderful it was. All in Star Trek-related costumes, except for two people dressed as Wookiees, and one girl who seemed to be a refugee from Blake 7. Passing through a huge pipe thrust into the side of the mountain, Alec emerged onto a wide terrace dominated by a fancifully designed house made of foam. He stopped short and gaped at it. "Like it?" Rusty McCabbage asked. "I love it," Alec pronounced, greed for the house and the lifestyle it suggested freighted in every word. "Thank you," replied McCabbage. "Come." He placed a fatherly hand on Alec's shoulder and directed him to view the valley below. It was a narrow, tree-lined trench between the relatively low mountains. Alec noticed immediately the futuristic domestic architecture sprouting up among the trees here and there like mushrooms on a rumpled beach towel. "Why would someone leave a beach towel where it could become a breeding ground for fungi?" Jerry asked. "I don't know," I shrugged my shoulders. "Why would my father use my beach hat with the French summertime words on it as insulation for an outdoor spigot? Odd things happen to fabrics." Jerry nodded reflectively. "Textiles," he murmured as I continued. "We live here in something approaching communal bliss," the faux Picard explained as he and Alec and the others entered the house. "An ideal community," Alec interpreted the older, for he was older, perhaps as much as 20 years older, man's words. McCabbage laughed. "Well, I don't know how ideal it is, but we like it." He sat down into a large, fuzzy beanbag and invited Alex to take a seat on any of the contoured perches scattered through the sunken den in which the group now dispersed. A few gathered in one corner around a machine that pumped narcotic gases into one's lungs through a candy-striped tube. As the giggling began, another subset became engrossed in a kind of game or ritual in which they very seriously passed a collection of colored polyhedrons among themselves in a complicated order that only the participants seemed privy to. Had Alec not been entirely focused on McCabbage and his words, he might have noticed here an individual perusing a book of pseudo-Mayan art, and there, one pulling himself up on a silken rope into a roof above through a hole in the ceiling. "Now, I enticed you here with the promise of a demonstration of our food replicator," McCabbage reminded Alec. "That's right." Alec sat up straighter in expectation. "Follow me." McCabbage led his guest through a sinuous corridor of hardened foam to a large open-plan kitchen and dining area. Everywhere were ferns under fluorescent lighting. The gurgle of aerators and aquariums was a constant background sound. There seemed to be a fish tank in every room in the house. "This is it." McCabbage gestured to a row of panels on the wall. Alec bent his head down towards one of the panels. "How does it work?" he asked. "Just like on Star Trek," McCabbage told him. "Tell it what you want and watch it materialize right in front of you." "Really?" Alec glanced at his host as if he had been offered the chance to revisit his childhood. "Really? Go ahead." Alec didn't know whether to clear his throat or not. He took a breath and said, "Monkey bread." He stared at the panel, waiting for it to slide to the side and reveal his chosen dish. "Monkey bread?" McCabbage repeated. "What's that?" Alec looked at the man. "It's a dessert made of canned biscuits cooked into a ring covered with cinnamon, brown sugar, and nuts." He stood up straight. "My mother used to make it," he added, half an explanation, half an apology. McCabbage frowned. "Wouldn't you rather have futuristic pork skins?" This last he directed at the panel, which then opened on a small chamber containing a plate of the requested item. He reached in and removed the dish, pretending that the plate was much hotter than it really was. "No, not really." Alec, amazed as he was at the appearance of the food, yet rejected it. "I just ate pork skins. I'd rather have something sweet now." "Are you sure?" McCabbage held up the plate temptingly. "They're made of foam." While Alec was finally tucking into something sweet provided by the fake food replicator, Clark Seville had tired of waiting for him to return and gone in search of him. He was still a little rattled by the revelation that I was the actual head of the suggestible trapezoid and all the ramifications that entailed, as well as my sudden ordering him off guard duty. But good agent that he was, Seville had accepted the orders and moved without hesitation on to the next task. His dead man's freedom training helped. He sat in the gizmo and thumbed through the pages of his image book until he grew calm and accepting of the new situation. Then, glancing at his watch, he decided that something must have happened to Alec. He left a note on the driver's seat explaining things and exited the car. He moved methodically through the crowd, scanning for the good-looking blonde head of Alex Spaghetti. Not seeing it, Seville expanded his search for anyone wearing white racing coveralls, as it was possible that Alec had purchased a mask at one of the booths that had been erected on either side of the road. Although several people were wearing similar outfits, none exactly matched the look of Alex, which had numerous patches related to the two-headed boxer sewn on it. Having made his way around the grounds at the impromptu festival twice without finding his quarry, Seville decided to head back to the car. He hadn't taken 2 steps, however, when he found his attention captured by a large TV showing one of the two-headed boxer films. Which one, he couldn't say. It wasn't a scene he had any memory of ever having seen before.